Previously, I began decorating my cardboard room box, and today I'm decorating the opposite wall. I got a few bundles of scrap wood at my local dollhouse store for $1 each, and I'm using some of the pieces to make a shelf to the left of the fireplace. I'm not sure what this piece of trim is intended for, but I like that it has a 90-degree angle and it provides the back and the top of the shelf. I'm making 3 accessories entirely by hand to display on the shelf, and I love how they all turn out. I'm using this piece of crown molding to make 2 brackets for the shelf by cutting 2 small slices. I'm using my miter shears, but you could also use a small saw or a craft knife. Before I attach the shelf brackets, I'm using my X-Acto knife to break up these clean lines and make the shelf look more rustic. To make the top shelf deeper so I can display more miniatures, I glued on this piece of wood, leaving some overhang in the front. The shelf will have 3 pegs, so I guesstimated where they should be and then glued in some pieces of toothpick. If you don't have a drill, you can glue the pieces of toothpick directly to the shelf, but they may not be quite as strong. To make these random bits of wood look more cohesive and to give it an old look, I'm doing a multi-part paint process. I'm starting with a dark brown base coat, which could either be an old layer of paint or maybe the stained underlying wood. For the main color, I'm using dark blue pale from Vallejo. Most of my paints are cheap acrylic paints, but I do have 4 nice bottles of paint, and this is one of them. I'm applying the paint lightly, making sure some of the brown is still visible. I want the shelf to give off those covered in lead paint vibes, so I'm using a metal tool to scrape away some of the paint. I wanted more dimension and depth, so I'm just dry brushing on some cream paint to highlight some of the textures and also make it look like there are at least 3 layers of paint on this one shelf. I'm really digging the rustic look, but it looks a little too clean, so I'm adding some watered down brown paint to add some grime. Sometimes this step looks like a mistake, but you can always remove some of the excess and remember that the wash dries a lot more subtle than it looks when it's wet. Now that the shelf is done, we can move on to the main attraction and start making some accessories. While I was working on the shelf, I had no idea what I was going to hang on it, but I was watching a show called It Bit Me about animal attacks. Somebody got attacked by a bear, and it gave me the idea of making a bear trap. I used my hammer to flatten the rounded rim of an aluminum baking tray lid, and now I'm cutting it into a narrow strip. The foothold trap has 2 halves that have serrated teeth, so I folded the aluminum in half and put some tape around it so I can cut both sides at the same time. I'm using the handle of a rather large paintbrush to get the correct semicircle shape for each side. I used super glue for the entire project and made the 2 halves into one circle. Then I bent to this small L-shaped piece and glued it to the outside of the circle in the middle. I used a combination of super glue and baking soda to reinforce all the joints and added this small piece across the middle. I used my hole punch to punch out a small circle and added a small amount of Q-tip to make the trigger plate stand up off of the backing. I finished the construction of the trap by adding a small amount of jewelry chain from an old broken necklace. I'm prepping the trap for paint by adding a mixture of black paint and Mod Podge. Whenever I'm painting something non-porous like metal or something like plastic, I like to add Mod Podge to the paint to help it stick. I'm using Dirty Down Rust from Goblin's Hut to make the entire trap rusty. I really like this product because it's water-based, so I can clean my brush with just normal water and it creates real rust through a chemical reaction. I paid $28 for less than an ounce, which is kind of crazy, but it seems to be lasting forever even though I use it all the time, and I'll definitely buy more when I run out. I absolutely love how this turned out, and I'm really happy with the black spots I added, which add a lot more depth and age. I'm hanging the trap from a hook and covering the top of the shelf with some dishes. I'm using super glue to create some stacks, but I want some gaps and irregularities, so I'm adding some small pieces of aluminum between a couple of the plates. I did the same with the stack of bowls and the mugs. I think the red is a little too vibrant for the space, so I'm painting everything with a mixture of black paint and Mod Podge. Once the black base coat dried, I followed it up with some silver metallic paint. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, but I think they actually may have looked better if I had left them the red spatterware. To tone down the red, I could have used a thin coating of Mod Podge mixed with some brown paint. I considered removing the paint with some nail polish remover, but instead I decided to move on and repair this old lantern I've had for quite a while by adding this glass ball to it. I glued all the accessories to the top of the shelf, and now I'm using this metal filigree piece to make a fireplace bellows. A fireplace bellows is used to blow air on a fire to either start a fire or save a fire that's about to burn out. I'm using this fancy metal piece on the front of the bellows for some added decor, but it's a little too wide, so I'm trimming off some of the excess with my pliers. I'm tracing the shape onto the rounded end of a popsicle stick to minimize how many cuts I have to make. I cut out 2 of the shapes and stained them brown with watered down paint. To give the bellows its distinctive tapered shape, I'm adding some small pieces of styrofoam tray so the ends will touch each other but the top part will have a gap. I'm using this piece of paper bag to look like the pieces of leather that join the 2 sides of a bellows. To make the paper bag look more like leather, I'm adding a coat of matte Mod Podge. Before the Mod Podge completely dried, I gently squeezed it to make the paper look more like the cracked leather you see on a bellows. I'm using a couple small pieces of mat board to make the handles. Mat board is made from layers of paper, so I'm removing a couple layers so the handles will sit nicely on the surface. To save me a little trouble once I start painting, I colored the edges with a black marker. The handle is pretty flat, which looks fine, but to make it look a little better and give it some dimension, I'm adding some wood glue. Wood glue does a great job of holding its shape as it's drying, as opposed to Elmer's glue, which tends to deflate and creates divots. I learned this trick from Aira from Bentley House Minis. Normally the handles would be part of the body, but that would have been a complete nightmare to cut, so hopefully these end up looking like wood and save me a lot of headache. I like to take the easy route on certain tasks like this that won't matter much in the end. The Mod Podge is completely dry, so I'm making the paper bag look more like leather by adding a thin wash of watered down brown paint. I'm removing the excess so the wash will settle in the deepest parts and hopefully add more dimension. To really highlight all of the textures of the paper, I'm dry brushing some cream paint. I love the huge difference this simple step makes. I want the bellows to look like it's covered in soot, but I was a little too heavy-handed with the black acrylic paint and I had to remove the excess with a damp paper towel. I probably should have used chalk pastels for the shading instead and practiced the technique on the back instead of the front. The only thing the bellows is missing is the tip where the air comes out. I carefully made a small hole at the end and shoved a small amount of toothpick in there. I wrapped a teeny piece of paper around the end and painted it so it looks metallic. When you're making something from scratch, it's a good idea to Google so you can have a reference image to work from. I've never used a bellows or seen one in real life, but I was making this entire thing from memory right until the end. I had this creepy feeling I was forgetting some kind of detail, so I finally Googled it, and that's when I added the air spout. I finished it off with a small amount of embroidery floss for hanging, and now I'm ready to make the third accessory. I'm making a miniature hearth broom to hang on the center peg, and that starts with a small bit of rope. I want this rope to end up looking like straight bristles on a broom, so I'm untwisting the different strands. I used a metal fork to comb out the threads, and now I'm using my hair straightener to straighten them out. I'm not sure if these fibers are natural or synthetic, so to avoid melting them, I'm using the hair straightener at a medium setting and keeping it moving. I keep my hair straightener with my hot glue gun, so that should give you an idea of how often I do my hair. I trimmed the fibers so they're straight across the top and used a combo of hot glue and wire to attach them to the broom handle. I also trimmed some of the excess length from the fibers and glued them into the center to add more volume to the broom. I used some red embroidery floss to add some details to the bristles, and now I'm trimming them. The bristles of a hearth broom can go straight across like a standard broom, but they can also be tapered so they're shorter on the edges and longer in the center. I've already made a broom with a more traditional shape, so I'm going for the tapered look. As I'm trimming the bristles, I'm doing a small amount at a time so I don't accidentally cut away too much. On the back of the broom, there are knots from the embroidery thread, so I'm making sure I cut the bristles so they look good from a certain angle, which is the part that will be displayed when I hang the broom. If you do make a mistake, you can always take some loose bristles and glue them into place and trim them once they're dry. Speaking of trimming, I'm cutting off the extra handle length and drilling a new hole for hanging. The longer handle length would have made the broom bristles hang too low and interfere with some plans I have for decorating the space under the shelf later. Since these small brooms are used for sweeping ashes away from your fireplace, I'm adding some black chalk pastels to look like soot. And here's a glimpse of the naughty backside. For a little more depth, I kissed just the tips of the bristles with a small amount of black paint. I obviously haven't learned my lesson because I started this on the front and I should have tested the technique on the back first. But I lucked out this time because I really like how the black paint looks. I think that was the perfect finishing touch, so now I'm preparing a space on the wall for the shelf. I often age things in place after I add them to the space, but it'll be really hard to add any shading around the shelf once it's glued in, so I'm doing it now. I'm starting with brown chalk pastels to add both what will look like dirt and also a shadow. In a previous video, I used strips of cereal box to make these faux wood paneling walls. Cereal box seems smooth, but once you paint it and start rubbing chalk pastels over the surface, you notice that it has a subtle horizontal texture. The chalk pastels get stuck in these grooves, and it either looks like the grain of the wood or maybe even saw marks from when the boards were milled. To make it look like the items on the shelf are casting a shadow, I'm adding some black chalk pastel, and I actually added more than I show here. To make it look like the bear trap has swung on the wall and left a mark, I traced the path with a pencil and then I added some black and brown chalk pastels. I think little details like this add to the realism and tell a story. I'm really happy with how these turned out, and I especially love the bear trap. The next video will be the final video for this project, so let me know about any ideas you have for food I should make. I'd also love some suggestions for what I should do to fill the space behind the chair. As always, thank you so much for watching.